This is lesson 3, Key Properties of Quadratics, but this time with tables. Let's first review looking at a graph. So here we have a graph of a quadratic function. Remember that U shape is our parabola. So to find the vertex, that is either the highest or lowest point of our graph. It's also where we see our turning point. So as we look left to right, we know our graph is decreasing and then it increases. So right at that turning point is the point 4, -4. This is our vertex. 4, -4. So the vertex is always a coordinate with an x and y. Next, we'll look at the x-intercept. So the x-intercept is when we cross the x-axis. So remember, our x-axis is this horizontal one, and it crosses right here at 2 and 6. So those coordinates here are 2, 0, and 6, 0. Now the y-intercept is when it crosses the y-axis. On this graph shown, we actually cannot see where it would cross the y-axis, so we're just going to skip this one. Next, we have the zeros. So remember, zeros, x-intercepts, solutions, those are all the same thing. So once you find the x-intercepts, you actually also found the zeros. So we'll just rewrite 2, 0 and 6, 0. All right, so next, AOS, that stands for our axis of symmetry. Axis of symmetry. And remember, the axis of symmetry is a vertical line that goes through the vertex, so through that green dot. And it's going to split our parabola, the shape, in half, so it's equal on both sides. The axis of symmetry is always an equation, and it will always be an x equals equation. And the value of x that it goes through is 4, so x equals 4 is our axis of symmetry. And then we want to know if this parabola here is opening up or down. And remember, it's either up like a cup or down like a frown. So since our parabola kind of looks like a cup, we know it is opening up. And since it's opening up, that means we have a minimum value, and that minimum value is always the y value of the vertex. So right here is our minimum point, and the y value is -4. So that's just a review of key properties of quadratics when looking at a graph. And so now we're going to look at tables and see how we can also find these same properties. There are two different ways we're going to be looking at how to find the key properties of tables. So the first way is we are going to find the repeating y values. Okay, so the vertex is between the y values that repeat. Then we can find x-intercepts when you have a coordinate where the y value is 0, like this. So when you have an x, 0, this is your x-intercept. And when you have 0y, this is your y-intercept. So let's look at these first two tables. All right, this first one, as you look at the y values, we have -16, -6, 0, 2, 0. All right, and notice we do have some repeating numbers right here at 0 and 0. So the point in between those two would be your vertex. So this is your vertex, 2, 2. And then your x-intercept, if you have an x value and then a y value is 0, that would be your x-intercept. For example, we have 1, 0, and then another one with y as a 0, 3, 0. So these two are both x-intercepts. 1, 0, and 3, 0. All right, your y-intercept, that is when your x value is 0. So here we have our second point, 0, negative 6. That is a y-intercept, 0, negative 6. Remember, the zeros of the graph are the same thing as your x-intercepts. So we'll just rewrite 1, 0, and 3, 0. Next, we have our axis of symmetry. So on a graph, we would look where that line cuts the parabola in half. And remember, that line always goes through the vertex. We know it's an x equals equation. And we know it goes through the vertex. So we look at what the x value of our vertex is. The x value of our vertex is 2. So the axis of symmetry is x equals 2. To know if our graph is opening up or down, we're going to look at how our y values are ascending or descending. So first I'm going to look at the y values before the vertex. We start at negative 16, then we go to negative 6, 0, and 2. Right now, those values are ascending. They're going up. And then as we go from the vertex and on, we go from 2 to 0, and we are descending. So if you were to sketch the parabola, you would have the first half is ascending, and the second half is descending. Notice that this parabola is opening down because it is down like a frown. To know what that min or max value is, in this case it would be a max value, we would look at the y value of the vertex. So the y value of the vertex is up here, and it is 2. Okay, so let's look at our next table. We're first going to look for those repeating y values. So we have 0, negative 3, negative 4, negative 3, and 0. So when we look at our repeating y values, this time we have negative 3s and 0s. So we look in the middle of those repeating y values and we find our vertex. So our vertex here would be 2, negative 4. So we'll write that here, 2, comma, negative 4. Now let's look for our x-intercepts. We have an x-intercept when y is 0. So I have 2 of those. I have at 0, 0 and 4, 0. Both of those have y values that are 0. 0, 0, and 4, 0. And we can go ahead and write those in for the zeros here. 0, 0, 4, 0. Now let's look for the y-intercept. So remember, the y-intercept is when our x value is 0. And it's actually going to be right here at 0, 0 as well. Because when you cross through the origin, that means you have an x and y-intercept there. So 0, 0 for your y-intercept as well. Now for our axis of symmetry. Remember, it is an x equals equation. And x is always equal to the x value of the vertex. So look back at the vertex. The x value here is 2, so x is equal to 2. And now we want to look at if this graph is opening up or opening down. So let's look at those y values before the vertex. Before the vertex, we have 0, negative 3, and negative 4. Those numbers are decreasing, they are descending. And then after the vertex, we have negative 4, -3, and 0. Those numbers are ascending. They are increasing. So if we were to sketch a parabola here, we would first be decreasing and then increasing after our vertex. So that means our graph, the parabola, has a shape where it's up like a cup, so where it's opening up. Okay? And now we look at our min or max value. In this case, we do have a minimum value. And our minimum value is the y value of the vertex. That y value is -4. All right, so that is the first way we look at key properties on the graph. And our next way is using Desmos. So I'm going to go up here to our second round of steps. So number one is we would create a table in Desmos. We create the table, we plug in all the values, and then the next row we're going to type in a regression. Now we've done this with exponential functions, and I believe we've also done it with linear as well. So how you'll type this in is you'll have y1 with a tilde, ax1 squared plus bx1 plus c. Once you have that typed in, then you'll have all the parameters show up for your new equation. You will type that equation into the next row, and then you can just look at the graph like we did before for your key properties. So for these last two graphs, I'm going to show you how to do the regression in Desmos and find the key properties. So I just want you to follow along and then write out all of our key properties that we have that we need to find. All right, so once you're in Desmos, you're first going to click on this plus button, and then you're going to create a table. Here I have already created the table, and that's third graph on your notes. Some things to remember is I want you to keep the x1 and y1 there. And as you're creating the table, you will actually see some dots from the coordinates appear. After your table is created, you are going to type in the regression. So that is this y1 with the tilde, x1 squared plus bx1 plus c. Please, please, please remember to always put those ones after the x's and y's. That's what tells Desmos to use this graph, the x1, y1 table. And once you type in this regression, it shows you your parameters right here. It tells you what to plug in for A, B, and C. And so that's what you put in the third row. So as you can see here, I've typed in that equation, plugged in for A, B, and C. So we get y equals 1x squared plus 8x plus 15. And now that we have our graph, we can just look here for all those key properties. So the first one I believe it's asking us for is the vertex. So our vertex is that turning point, or the lowest or highest point on our graph. So you see from left to right, we're decreasing, then we're increasing. So our vertex is right here. So for your vertex, you will put the coordinate -4, -1. Next, we'll look at those x-intercepts. Now, when you're in Desmos, you can actually click on each of these points, and it will give you what those coordinates are. So we look on where this is crossing the x-axis at -5 and -3. So the coordinates for our x-intercepts are -5, 0 and -3, 0. All right, so now we can also write the same thing for our zeros. So the zeros are also -5, 0 and -3, 0. Next, we're going to look at for our y-intercept. Now on Desmos, you would be able to move this graph around. And so if I were to move this graph down, I would see that my y-intercept was at 0, 15. That's when it crosses the y-axis. All right, so then our axis of symmetry. So the axis of symmetry goes through that vertex, that vertical line through the vertex, and it is an x equals -4 because that is the x value of your vertex. And looking at this graph, we can see that it is opening up like a cup. And the minimum value is -1 because that is the y value of our vertex. Let's do this one last time with our last graph. All right, so with our last graph, we're going to again create a table here. And then you would type in the x and y values from the graph like I have here. Again, make sure that you have x1 and y1 at the top. Now we can put in the regression equation. So once you put in that regression equation, you're going to get all of the parameters right down here. So now we know what to plug in for A, B, and C into the new line. All right, so I plugged them in here. I plugged in our equation y equals 8x squared minus 32x plus 23. And now we can find all of the key properties. So our vertex, remember the turning point, it's decreasing, then turns to increasing. So the vertex right here, if you were to click on this in Desmos, it would just give you the point. Our vertex is 2, -9. So this is our vertex. And now let's look at those x-intercepts. So my x-intercepts are when they cross the x-axis. And so that is at 1, 0, and 3, 0. And remember, your x-intercept is the same thing as your zeros. Now let's look at the y-intercept. Remember, that's when it crosses the y-axis, which would be right up here. And that y value here is 23. So the y-intercept coordinate would be 0, 23. Now our axis of symmetry. The axis of symmetry is an x equals equation. And remember that axis goes through the vertex. So the x value of our vertex is 2. So x equals 2 is the equation for our axis of symmetry. And looking at this graph, since it looks like it's a cup, that means it's opening up like a cup. And it has a minimum, and the minimum value is the y value right here. And we can just look at the y value of the vertex. Now the y value here is -9. So our minimum is -9. So that's 2 ways we can look at how to find properties of quadratics when looking at the table.